So welcome back to Managerial Accounting. The purpose of this little video is to review the results of exam number one and the solutions therein. I'm going to break it into two parts. First of all, I'm going to talk about the grades overall, and then review the take-home part of the exam. And then we'll do a separate little mini lecture on the in-class multiple choice part of the exam. So let's start with the results overall. So here are the scores. Let's make it a little bit bigger here. So the average grade was a 79, which for a community college managerial accounting exam is pretty good. So overall, each one of you, there's 10 of you in this class, each one of you is those little points. So we actually did have 100. Congratulations, Haluk. And we had a couple that came pretty close to 100. So congratulations to you two as well. And then we had grades in the 80s, and we had grades in the 70s. We had one little outlier who was down here in the 50 range, which was not where you want to be, but that shows you overall the grades were pretty good. And not surprisingly, you all did well on the take-home part of the exam. And let's go through that quickly. So here are the questions on the take-home exam. We'll start with the questions, and then we'll follow up with the solutions as well. So there were 4 questions, each worth 10 points. So we give you some information about the Zoe Corporation. So we tell you what the purchases were. We tell you all the other information about inventory and overhead and work in process and finished goods and so forth. And on the basis of this, you had to prepare a statement of cost of goods manufactured, an income statement for the month ended for March, and the inventory on the balance sheet. Now, one point I'll make here is if you want to get full credit on these questions, you got to, if I say for a statement of cost of goods manufactured, I'm not just looking for your computations there, I'm looking for a full statement in good form of goods manufactured. Same thing with the income statement. So when you look at the results that I'm going to hand out on Tuesday, if you see format, what that means is that you had the right numbers, but you didn't put it in the right format. So if we were asked for statements here, you got to put them in good form as far as the statements. So here's the information that you were given. And now on the basis of that, you got to prepare a statement of cost of goods manufactured, an income statement, and an inventory section of the balance sheet, all in good form. So to get full credit on that, this is what I needed to see. I need to see a formal statement of goods manufactured. So I recommended you use 3-column format. So you had to show what the beginning materials, the beginning work in process was. You had to figure out what the materials used was or were. So you have to do beginning materials plus purchases, material available for use minus ending materials work at the end of the period, and that gives you the cost of materials used. So it's the cost of materials used plus the factory overhead plus the factory overhead will give you the total manufacturing costs incurred. Add that to the beginning work in process. That'll give you the total manufacturing costs. And then out of that, you have to subtract out the ending work in process. So the cost of goods manufactured is $150,500. I think just about all of you got this correct. Where you lost points was you didn't put it in the proper format. So if you just showed your computations and you didn't show the format of statement of cost of goods manufactured, you didn't get full credit for it. Then you had to do the income statement. The income statement was the revenue minus, you had to figure out the cost of goods sold, which was beginning inventory, plus cost of goods not purchased, but cost of goods manufactured, gives you finished goods available for sale, minus the ending inventory gives you cost of goods sold. Subtract that from the sales, that gives you the gross profit. Subtract out the selling and administrative expenses, and you get the net income. So you had net income in there, $36,500. Then you had to show what the inventory was, and the inventory has 3 components. So it's finished goods plus work in process plus materials. You started with materials and then did work in process, didn't finish goods, that's fine. But these are your 3 components of inventory. Okay. Remember, a manufacturer has 3 different types of inventory. It has materials, work in process, and finished goods, whereas a retailer or a merchandiser would only have finished goods. All right, so that was the first one. If you got to get 10 points on that, you had to put it in good form. You had to show the cost of goods manufactured. you had to show the net income, and you had to show the ending inventory of these three components. Okay, the second thing, this is where you had to do journal entries, and where a couple of you lost credit here is you didn't put these in proper form. So the proper form shows the debit and then the credit, and the credit is indented from the debit. So you had to journalize the entry for the purchase of paper, journalize the entry for the transfer of raw materials to work in process, the application of direct labor, and the application of direct manufacturing overhead to job 157A, while in printing department, and you had to journalize the transfer of the costs from the printing department to the folding department. Then you had to journalize the application of direct labor and application of the manufacturing overhead in the folding department. And then you had to journalize the transfer of finished goods to inventory at actual cost, right? So we're looking for all these specific journal entries. And most of you had the correct numbers. Where a number of you lost credit is you didn't show the actual format. So this is a little indent here. This should be actually over to the right. Let's see, there we go. Okay, you had to show the purchase of raw materials as a debit to raw materials and a credit to accounts payable. Then you had the requisition of raw materials to the printing department, so it's a debit to work in process printing and a credit to raw materials. Then you had the incurring wages in the printing department, so a debit to work in process printing, credit wages payable. Then you had the application of overhead to the printing department, so it's a debit to work in process and a credit to overhead. Remember, your costs of manufacturing are to include materials and then labor and then overhead, so you see those costs being incurred by the printing department. Then you had the transfer of costs out of the printing department to the folding department, so you have a debit to work in process folding and a credit to work in process printing. And then you had the incurrence of wages and factory overhead in the folding department, so debit work in process folding, credit wages payable, debit work in process folding and a credit to factory overhead. Then you had the transfer of finished goods out of the folding department into the finished goods. Okay, so you have two departments there. You got printing, and then the costs go from printing to folding, and after folding they go to finished goods. So to get full credit on this, you had to show all these different journal entries. If some of you combined some of these journal entries, that was fine. I didn't mind that. So if you debited work in process for the full amount of materials, wages, and factory overhead and came up with one debit, that was fine. And at a series of credits, that was okay. But you had to show, to get full credit, you would have had to show all these separate entries, and you would have had to show them in proper form. So proper form doesn't mean you just list them. You have to show which is a debit and which is a credit. So a couple of you had recaps of your costs, which were good. But that was what I asked for. I asked for the actual journal entries. So these are the actual journal entries. Exercise 3. So these were the costs that were incurred, and we want you to prepare Austin Department's Department A cost of production report for December. Okay, so here's where you have to consider the equivalent units, and you have to consider the costs that were transferred to the next department, and you have to come up with the ending work in process as well. Okay, so this is what's given. So what's given is you had 12,000 units at the beginning of the period that were 60% complete with regard to conversion costs. And at December 31st, you had 5,000 units, which were 40% complete with regard to conversion costs. Started in December. So if you wanted, these are the started in December. So if started and you have to figure out what the started and completed was. Here's what's direct materials costs incurred. And here were the conversion costs incurred. So on the basis of this, you have to figure out what the actual production report. And I gave you a little handout that was helpful in doing this. So first thing, you have to figure out the equivalent units. So you had 26,000 units to account for between the beginning work in process and the received from the materials flow room. So you had 26,000 units. But then when you do equivalent units, what you would have come up with is direct materials. Since materials were added at the beginning of the process, you had no direct materials added as far as the beginning inventory was concerned of work in process, because materials are added at the beginning of the process. And if they were 60% complete with regard to the last period, that means 40% were complete there in this period. So 40% of 12,000 gives you 48. The started and completed is 9,000. And the started and completed is 9,000. They're fully complete with regard to materials and fully complete with regard to conversion. So there is the costs incurred transferred to the next department. And then you have ending work in process of 5,000 units. Since the materials are added at the beginning of the process, you have at the ending work in process those 5,000 direct materials, but they were 40% complete with regard to materials. So 40% times 5,000 gives you 2,000. And most of you did pretty good up to this point where you got the cost per equivalent unit. So you had materials cost of 106,400 divided by 14,000 equivalent units. So your cost per equivalent unit of materials is 760. Your cost of equivalent units per conversion cost is 70,310 divided by 15,800, which gives you $4.40. So here is your inventory in process. These are the costs incurred. So here's the total cost to account for. How do you account for the $317,100? Well, you had beginning inventory of 140,400. And then you had to complete that beginning inventory, and the beginning inventory that you completed was 0 with respect to materials and 21,360 with regard to additional conversion costs. Okay, started and completed, you had 68,400 was with regard to materials, 40,050 with regard to conversion costs. That gives you 108,450. So you had costs incurred, costs transferred to finished goods of 270,210, and you had ending work in process cost of $38,000 worth of materials and $8,800 with regard to conversion costs. So you get a total there of $46,900. Right. So there is your total allocation of the cost of $317,710. So there's your calculations there. Okay, and the last one, this had to do with activity-based costing. So you had 3 activities. You had stamping, you had assembly, and you had setup. These were your budgeted costs. And they tell you that the budgeted costs, the activity base was stamping hours for machine hours for stamping, labor hours for assembly, and number of setups for setup costs. So these were your costs. And now here are your number of setups between saws and drills. So when you come up with the actual, you had to determine the activity rate for each activity. So machine hours were 10,000, labor hours were 20,000, and number of setups was 15. So these are the numbers here that you use for the rate to use for activity. So determine the activity rate for each activity. And then to determine the factory overhead for each unit of product, you got to multiply by the number of activity in each department for each product. So for saws, there were 4,000 hours and 4,000 machine hours. So that's 4,000 hours in terms of whatever the stamping cost is, 7,000 direct labor hours for whatever the cost per labor hour is. And setup, there were 3 setups. Right, so 2 phases here, 2 steps. One, get the activity cost per unit. In this case, it's per machine hour. On this next one, for assembly, it's per labor hour. And for setup, it's per setup. And then you got to multiply by the level of activity. So determine the activity rate for each activity and determine the factory overhead to apply for each product. Okay, and the number of products produced, we had 700 produced for saws, and we had 600 produced for drills. So here's your activity rate. Stamping is 200,000 divided by 10,000, which is $20 per machine hour. Assembly is 400,000 divided by 20, which is $20 per labor hour. And setup is $30,000 divided by 15 setups, which gives you $2,000 per setup. All right. So what you need to do to get the overhead cost assigned to each unit, you had 4,000 machine hours for in terms of stamping, in terms of saws. You had 7,000 assembly hours times 20, and you had 3 setups, so 3 times 2,000. And you had to take that number and divide by 500, which gives you $452. For drills, you had 6,000 in terms of stamping machine hours, so 6,000 times 20. In terms of assembly, you had 13,000 hours at $20 per hour. And with regard to setup, you had 12 setups at $2,000 per unit divided by 600. So these are your overhead costs per unit. For saws, it's $452, and for drills, it's $672.33. Okay. So I hope you found that little review useful. Most of you did real well on the take-home exam, which is to be expected. The take-home tends to be things that we've done in class. Take-home is similar to what we do in the homework, so I expect you to all do well, and plus you're under no time pressures when you do the take-home. So the challenge that many of you had was not so much with the take-home, but with the multiple choice part. With regard to the take-home, a couple of you lost credit because you did not put them in proper format. So please try to be mindful of putting things in proper format in the future. Alrighty, so we will see you again shortly, and come on back for the multiple choice part of the review. See you shortly. Adios, au revoir, auf Wiedersehen, hasta luego.